apologize for the delay in getting started, ladies and gentlemen. We had to go to a commercial break. As I told you, someday I'm going to have my own program, but we did have to take a few minutes to continue with our legal arguments. We've been working since early this morning, so thank you for your cooperation. At this point, I'm going to call upon the attorneys to give you the opening statements, and we go first to the plaintiff, so Mr. Burke.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, with your permission, if I could stand here, my back to you.
Move it around.
All right. Your Honor, counsel, Steve, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Good afternoon. Honestly, I expected at some point that I'd be working for him. Those aren't my words. Those are the words of Captain Vincent Sabo, the executive officer of the New Brunswick Police Department, the second in command of the entire department, responding to a question about Steve that I had asked Captain Sabo at his deposition. Steve never became a captain, and that's part of the reason we're here today, but I'll come back to that. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Steve Middleton. Steve began his service to the city of New Brunswick as a police officer in 1994. He served for almost 20 years, and he had a distinguished career. Steve was the recipient of numerous commendations. Steve was also the recipient of Medals of Valor, one of the highest awards you can earn as a police officer. It would take some time to list all of the heroic actions Steve took while serving as a police officer. But I would just like to read one report written about Steve by Captain Les Levine. Captain Levine writes, on May 27, 2004, Sergeant Steve Middleton and Police Officer Kay Chendak were in a marked patrol unit. They observed a motor vehicle violation and executed a motor vehicle stop at Livingston Avenue and Welton Street. Upon approaching the vehicle, Sergeant Middleton noticed the suspect moving around in the vehicle. Sergeant Middleton observed that the suspect was trying to conceal a handgun in his waistband. Both officers removed the suspect from the vehicle, and a .357 caliber handgun loaded with hollow point bullets was recovered from the suspect's waistband. A second handgun was recovered from a backpack which belonged to the suspect. The suspect gave a tape statement to Detective Smith that both guns were his. I recommend that Sergeant Middleton and Police Officer Chendak be commended for their professionalism and outstanding police work. That's just one example of the type of work that Steve performed on the streets of the city of New Brunswick. Steve is also a family man. He's got a wife and 2 daughters. And he lives here in Middlesex County in the township of Monroe. He grew up close by in East Brunswick. And he currently works as a teacher for the Asbury Park Board of Education. Partly in recognition of his excellent police work, Steve became a sergeant in 2001. But Steve wasn't going to stop there. Steve was intent on becoming a lieutenant and then a captain, the first African-American captain in the history of the city of New Brunswick. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with ranks within a police department, the first level is police officer, the second is sergeant, the third is lieutenant, and the highest uniform level is captain. New Brunswick also has a police director who runs the department and at times in the past has had a deputy director. No African American has ever held the position of director of the New Brunswick Police Department. No African American has ever held the position of deputy director of the New Brunswick Police Department. And no African American has ever held the position of captain of the New Brunswick Police Department. Steve was determined to change that. In January of 2008, a list of sergeants eligible for promotion to the position of lieutenant was promulgated. Steve was number 4 on the list. Numbers 1, 2, and 3, all white males, were promoted in January of 2009. Only one of those 3 was actually filling an open position. The other 2 were simply given the rank of lieutenant and all the benefits that came with it, including increased pay. But they stayed in the same roles that they were functioning in as sergeants. Steve was hopeful that he too might be promoted also. But by the end of 2009, Steve was still a sergeant. Then in March 2010, 5 senior officers of the New Brunswick Police Department retired. The director, Captain Levine, a lieutenant, and 2 sergeants. Nevertheless, Steve was not promoted. The new police director, Peter Mangarella, transferred a number of African American officers from favorable positions to less favorable positions within the department. And when a white lieutenant was transferred from one division to another, and there was an opportunity to promote Steve to fill that position, Mangarella instead filled the position with a white sergeant. A few months later, in June of 2010, one of the white officers who was promoted to lieutenant ahead of Steve, Robert Tierney, he was one of the 3 that I referenced earlier, was accused of criminal wrongdoing. Instead of removing him from his position immediately, the city kept him in the position for approximately 3 more months. It wasn't until September of 2010, approximately 3 months later, after he was formally charged by the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office and indicted, that he was suspended with pay from his position. Now, you might think that the defendants would have used this opportunity to promote Steve. After all, yet another lieutenant's spot, formerly held by a white lieutenant, needed to be filled. What better way to instill public confidence in the police department after one of its own was charged with criminal wrongdoing, voter fraud, theft of benefits, than by promoting Steve to fill that position? But Steve wasn't promoted. He wasn't promoted in June 2010 when defendants discovered the wrongdoing, and he wasn't promoted in September 2010 when Tierney was finally suspended. Instead, Mangarella had white sergeants work overtime to fill the role previously held by Lieutenant Tierney. In fact, instead of promoting Steve, the city paid over $28,000 in overtime. Steve was understandably distraught. He thought he was never going to be promoted. When he went to Anthony Caputo, the current and former police director, I'll explain that later, to express his concern, Caputo told Steve, "Don't worry, Steve. You'll be promoted eventually. You're black. If we don't promote you, you'll sue us." Think about how offensive that is. Caputo didn't say Steve would be promoted because of his background, his education, his record of service, his commendations, but because he was black, and the city didn't want to get sued. Eventually, in January of the following year, 2011, Steve was finally promoted to the position of lieutenant, just as the list he was on was about to expire. However, by the time he was promoted, it was too late for Steve to sit for the upcoming examination for promotion to captain. That's because in order to be eligible for promotion to captain, you need 1 year in grade as a lieutenant. Because the city delayed in promoting Steve for approximately 2 years, he was not eligible to take the next opportunity to compete for a spot as New Brunswick's first African American captain. As a result, Steve filed this lawsuit on February 29, 2012. Now, it's not easy to sue your employer. It's not easy to accuse your employer of racial discrimination, especially when you're a police officer. And it wasn't easy for Steve. Steve was told the city doesn't like being sued. Steve was told he wasn't being a team player. These were messages from Anthony Caputo, the director of the police department. But Steve was determined to stand up for what is right. And for that, he paid a heavy price. On July 23, 2012, radio dispatches came into police headquarters in the city of New Brunswick. A dangerous criminal was leading police on a chase in the next town over, North Brunswick. The chase was going to enter the city of New Brunswick. Steve could have stayed where he was, but he volunteered to ride as a passenger with another officer, Sergeant John Langan, in an attempt to apprehend this fleeing felon. The pursuit crossed over from North Brunswick into New Brunswick. At that point, officers from the city of New Brunswick took over. At some point thereafter, the car Steve was riding in as a passenger became the lead vehicle in the pursuit. The pursuit ended with the successful apprehension of the fleeing felon. Even more importantly, no civilians or bystanders were injured. Now, you might think Steve was provided an award for his bravery. Instead, the defendants initiated an internal affairs investigation. Steve, who wasn't even driving, was charged with 23 separate violations, and he was suspended from the force for 8 days. Now, a suspension of 8 days is a big deal. Anything more than 5 days is considered major discipline. Major discipline affects an officer's ability to be promoted. And after Steve was hit with major discipline, the city of New Brunswick took the position in this lawsuit that Steve wouldn't have made captain anyway because of his 8-day suspension. Disciplining an employee who sues for racial discrimination is against the law. So the city has taken the position that they didn't discipline plaintiff because he filed a lawsuit. They disciplined him because he violated rules and regulations, attorney general guidelines during the pursuit. Well, the real reason plaintiff received major discipline after bringing this lawsuit is for you to decide. What is absolutely undisputed, however, is that Steve is the only officer ever to receive major discipline in connection with a police pursuit. And he wasn't even driving. The white sergeant who Steve was riding with, by the way, was also disciplined, but he only received a 4-day suspension. That's considered minor discipline. So to recap, Steve is involved in a police pursuit. Steve's a passenger in the police car. Steve receives an 8-day suspension. The white sergeant, who was actually driving the car, receives a 4-day suspension. Half the amount of time Steve received, and as we know, Steve is African American. Now, the defendants and their expert witnesses are going to tell you that Steve is lucky on the issue of the promotion. They're going to tell you that Steve should be grateful to them. After all, he was eventually promoted to the rank of lieutenant, albeit too late to qualify to sit for the position of captain. You're going to hear that Mangarella allegedly went and spoke with Mayor Cahill about promoting Steve to lieutenant in March of 2010. However, you're also going to hear that there is no written documentation of that purported meeting, even though Mangarella did document his request to promote a white officer to the rank of lieutenant around the exact same time. You're going to hear from the defendants that the defendants didn't promote Steve in 2010 because they didn't have the money. You're going to hear a lot about that, believe me. You're going to hear all about their financial problems and a housing crisis, and it's going to be the subject of a lot of testimony. But you're also going to hear that the city of New Brunswick had a $1.2 million surplus that very same year. On the issue of the retaliation after Steve filed suit, the defendants will probably tell you that even though Steve was the only officer ever to receive major discipline for involvement in a police pursuit, he got off easy. They could have fired him. You're going to hear that the police car Steve was in was speeding to keep up with the fleeing suspect. That's certainly true. You're going to hear terms such as vehicle paralleling and vehicle contact. If you're lucky, they may even show you the video. The defendant's witnesses will talk about how dangerous the pursuit was and why they were justified in disciplining plaintiff so harshly. But you are also going to hear that African American officers in the City of New Brunswick Police Department are routinely subject to heightened scrutiny, less favorable assignments, and more severe discipline. And you're also going to hear that police officers' actions during police pursuits are rarely, if ever, even investigated. In fact, before Steve was disciplined and after he filed suit for discrimination, no police officer had been suspended for involvement in police pursuit in the history of the City of New Brunswick. I want to take this opportunity to thank you for your service. Our system depends on people like you, neutral, detached, unbiased members of the community, to give up your time to settle disputes. Steve has waited a long time for his day in court. This case was filed over 5 years ago. Now, during that time, a lot's happened. The parties have had an opportunity to engage in what we call discovery to prepare this case for trial. Depositions were taken, including Steve's deposition, which lasted 4 full days. So it's been a long road to get here. But we're here now. My father and I are privileged to represent Steve Middleton, who wasn't afraid to stand up for what's right in the face of injustice. And I am privileged to have been given this opportunity to tell you just a brief bit about Steve's story. Now, as an aside, this is my first opening in a civil trial, so hopefully I didn't screw it up too bad, but if I did, I'm glad there's a camera recording which have recorded it for all posterity. Ladies and gentlemen, this case should be completed within 2 weeks. After you have heard the evidence, you will hear from myself or my father again when we make our closing statement. I am confident that after you consider the facts and the testimony, you will return a verdict in favor of Steve Middleton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bird.
Thank you.
Mr. Cannell?
Thank you, Judge. Good afternoon. I am William Cannell, and I represent the city of New Brunswick, and my niece and partner, Beth Ann Cannell Connor, is also going to participate in this trial. It seems like we've got a family act going with both counsels involved here. But I want to start as well that on behalf of the city and its taxpayers, I want to thank you for agreeing to serve as jurors. You know, our system of justice is the best in the world. And you know why it's the best in the world? It's because of people like you. The collective wisdom of a cross-section of the public, which you now represent, are the best way for disputes and questions of fact to be realized, because you all bring your common experiences into the courtroom. You're not supposed to leave them at the door of the courtroom. You all are subject to your own experiences, education, backgrounds, and things of that nature. You're to keep them with you because that's what it's all about. And I am confident that when you hear the evidence in this case, you are going to conclude without a doubt that the city of New Brunswick treated this man fairly and appropriately without anything to do with his race. Mr. Middleton maintains that he was discriminated against due to his race, but I submit to you there is no evidence of that. Zero evidence that he was discriminated as a result of his race. In fact, he was a friend of the director of police, Caputo. He was a friend of the mayor's. The mayor actually married him, performed a marriage ceremony for him. They wanted to make Steve Middleton. And we're going to talk about the reasons why that didn't happen when he said it did. But it did happen. He got promoted off the list once he was on the list and eligible to be promoted. And we'll talk about why all of that is so in just a moment. Mangarella, who's the director who succeeded Caputo as director in March 1st, 2010, was the director who actually got and lobbied for him to be promoted. We're going to talk about the instances when that happened, after he assumed the duties of director on March 1st, 2010, which was the day after Caputo had retired. Now, some of you, we've got to explain basically what civil service is all about. And that's a key part of this case. Civil service is an agency of the state of New Jersey. It used to be called the Department of Personnel. And what that was formulated and founded in order that there would be an objective method to promote officers. First of all, to hire officers that are going to be hired by these municipalities. Approximately half of the municipalities in the state are civil service communities. And when you have the civil service criteria, they control the hiring. So people who they take a civil service test, if you want to become a police officer, they deal with the questions, they deal with the testing, they deal with the grading of the test, and then they formulate a list. And that's available to all the state of New Jersey. And the state of New Jersey can then, the municipalities in the state of New Jersey can then promote off that list. That's what happens when you're a patrolman. They also control all the promotions. They control the promotions to sergeant, they control the promotions to lieutenant and to captain. And as you go up the ladder, obviously you're going to have a narrowing group of people that are eligible, because you got a lot more patrolmen eligible for a sergeant's test than you have sergeants available to a lieutenant's test and lieutenants available to a captain's test. But the same process exists, which is that the tests are formulated, they're announced by civil service. The municipalities don't have an opportunity to do that. So they're announced by civil service. Civil service sets the deadline within which somebody is eligible to sit for the test. Civil service then gives the test, and these officers all study real hard when they want to be promoted. And they go to schools and they pay for these schools and things of that nature. It's a big deal. And they all know that basically you've got to come out on top. Because if you don't come out on top, you're not going to get promoted. Or there's a chance you're not going to get promoted. And we'll talk about that as we go through the process involving Steve Middleton himself. New Brunswick is a city of about 60,000 people. It's a very diverse city, as you guys know very well, being residents of the county. They've got almost 750 employees in the city. They've got about 150 police officers. They've got over 100 firemen. They've got emergency services. They've got water commission people. They've got DPW workers. It's a very large city in terms of comparison to the other cities in the Middlesex County. It's not the city of Newark, but it's the largest in Middlesex County. And New Brunswick is one of these civil service communities, meaning that they have to abide by civil service with respect to the manner in which people are going to be promoted. But then once they submit a promotion list, it is then up to the entity to decide on whether or not, first of all, they're going to participate in the test, meaning do you have a need to fill these things, these positions. And if they do, they will then submit to civil service and say, we want to participate, meaning our officers want to participate in the test, and they will take the test, and then they have to determine whether or not they pass or not. So, civil service has what is called a rule of three also, which may or may not be considered by the public entity when they're going to be hiring somebody. So once the civil service agency formulates a promotion test, they call it an eligible list for promotion. Out of the top 3 candidates, an entity has the chance or the authority to choose one out of the top 3 candidates. But if they're going to skip somebody, they have to document and explain why they skip somebody. First of all, you can't skip a veteran under these rules. And you certainly can't do it for a discriminatory purpose, because if you did that, you'd have to explain how you're going to be skipping a minority to get to a white person. So the city of New Brunswick doesn't skip people. They go off the list. And you know what the reason for that is? The people that study for these tests and come out on top of the test are generally considered to be the most qualified guys. You got 70% of the test or girls. 70% of the test is governed by the test score. And then 30% of your score is based upon seniority and various other factors that go along with that 30%. And then that accumulated score then gets posted, and that's what happens. So let's talk about the paramilitary aspect of a police department. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that police departments have ranks because they need to have control over the police officers that are out on the street. It's especially important to have ranks in the patrol division. The patrol division is that it's the front line. It's your infantry right on the front line, it's your Green Berets. These are the guys out on the street dealing with whatever occurs out in the street. And New Brunswick is a tough place in certain areas of New Brunswick. So you need to have police officers who are being supervised by sergeants, sergeants being supervised by lieutenants, and that lieutenant, who's just generally going to be one lieutenant from each squad or each shift, they're going to have a captain who's the overall commander of the patrol or operations division. And that chain of command has to be maintained. It's different from a detective bureau where you might have a sergeant being involved in a detective bureau, and generally you're going to want to have a lieutenant in charge of that detective bureau or a captain, but not necessarily in certain circumstances do you need to have that kind of chain of command dealt with. So with this background, it gives you an idea of what is involved in terms of the promotions of police officers. Now, the other thing that hopefully you all remember, and it's a big part of this case, we had a recession that began in the end of 2008. It was under President Bush's last term, the last year before President Obama took over. And if you remember, it hit everybody real hard. And it continued through 2009 and 2010. And with respect to municipalities, it has a domino effect or a late effect, because in 2008 the budgets were already created for 2008, so it didn't affect what was going on in 2008 in terms of how the cities were able to run their departments. But things began to change in 2009. What happens is that when people are being laid off, in fact, the city of New Brunswick and Mayor Cahill did one of the most phenomenal jobs in the state of New Jersey with respect to this period of time. The city of Newark laid off over 100 cops. All the cities, the big cities, are laying off cops all over the place. There was massive layoffs in other departments. Mayor Cahill made a decision, I want to avoid layoffs and furloughs. And what he did is he asked all of the department heads to come in, and he gave them all, a hard lesson. We're going to tighten our belts because we don't have any option. And what happens here is that when you have big buildings in town, and I'm not talking about the hospitals or things like that, but you've got commercial space and a business goes out of business, and now all of a sudden you got vacancies in that apartment. Well, they're paying a bunch of, or that office building, they're paying a bunch of taxes based upon their ability to keep that tax base available and also to pay their taxes for a full occupancy. But then there stopped being full occupancies. The commercial space was drying up. They filed tax appeals. This is something that would have been continuing in 2009 and 2010. In 2010, it got so bad that the state of New Jersey stopped 2.5 million in probably April of 2010 is when they told the city of New Brunswick, you're used to getting $18.5 million from the state of New Jersey to help you balance your budget and run things. In basically April of 2010, May of 2010, the city of New Brunswick was told, we're cutting you $2.5 million. And that's going to fit into what we're talking about here in terms of, did they have money to do what they wanted to do? So in 2009, Mayor Cahill, as I told you, meets with these department heads. And he goes to the police department, and they've got a PBA and a SOA, which is the Police Benevolent Association of the Superior Officers. And he goes to those union heads, and he says, go to your union heads and see if they will forego the last year of their raises for 2009. And because we're looking to save these guys' jobs. We're looking to save cops from being laid off. They go to the union heads meet with their unions, and they concluded that they would not forego their raises for their last year. The mayor is advised of that. He says, okay, you've got a contractual right. That was negotiated. 2009, you've got your raise, we're going to give you your raise. However, there's not going to be any promotions, and anybody that is retiring from the police department, we're going to have their duties assumed by others. We're going to, there was a freeze for all management personnel, all administration, no raises for 2009 and 2010. The police department got their raises though. In 2010, when they renegotiated their contracts, the police did not get a raise for that year, and then they got small raises for 2011, 12, 13, and 14. The mayor also made other type of arrangements to try to save money in the city because he's representing the taxpayers. He's representing people like you and us. And what he did is there was a man who was in charge of the Department of the Water Commission. And he passed away, and the business administrator assumed his duties, and the mayor gave an extra $15,000 to do both jobs. The Department of Engineering department head, he retired. The Department of Public Works was given $10,000 to do his job. So these $25,000 of expenditures saved $250,000. That's just an illustration of the things that had to be done in this city because of the dire straits that the city was in with respect to what was going on. Is it unreasonable that he says we're going to have a freeze on promotions? The last promotions that happened in the city of New Brunswick was on January 9th, 2009. We're talking now about the list that Steve Middleton was on. He was on a list that was in effect from 2008 until 2011. That's the list that he was ultimately promoted off of. And in 2009, January of 2009, there was an opening in the patrol division, and as I said, there was a lieutenant who had retired in the patrol division. We had to get another patrol lieutenant, and Tierney filled that bill. We also had Carroll and Wolf, who were 1 and 2 on the list. Carroll was doing the job of in internal affairs, and he was doing it as a sergeant, and that poses problems when you have sergeants involved in internal affairs as commanders without having a superior officer. For example, in this case, you had Sergeant Middleton. You actually had, later in the pursuit, you had Lieutenant Middleton. And you need to have, it's advisable to have a commander in higher rank to be investigating cases when possible. And what happened is, so therefore, Carroll, who was number 1 on the list, they don't like to skip anybody, so he was promoted to lieutenant. Wolf was in charge of 4 different divisions, or 3 or 4 different divisions within the department. He had communications, records, IT, and it was appropriate because of all of the people that he was supervising that he be promoted to lieutenant. Now, what that did is that left Steve as number 1 on the list. And when he was on number 1 on the list in January of 2009, you got to remember now, we got the meeting, no promotions, everybody's going to be filling up positions of everybody else. So he sat on the list, and Director Caputo, his friend, and a guy who actually helped him get transfers throughout his career as a police officer, basically told him, he says, we want to make you, but we don't have the money. And he admits that he was told that. Now we get to 2010. And in February of 2010, like Mr. Berg said to you, there were 5 retirements of superior officers. And what happened is Governor Christie had signed a bill also looking to help the taxpayers in terms of dealing with the pension disaster or the pension problems that exist in the state of New Jersey for police and fire, as well as the teachers union. But let's talk about the police and fire. And he said that they were going to ask these people to pay more a larger contribution towards their pensions, and also a larger contribution towards their medical benefits. including people that retired after a certain date. So he gave a deadline date. He said, anybody that retires by a certain date, you're going to be grandfathered, you're going to be involved in the old system. Anybody that doesn't retire by that date, you're going to be assessed these higher costs of pension and medical benefits. Mass retirements around the state. And 5 of these retirements in New Brunswick included Captain Levine. First of all, it included Director Caputo, who was a captain of police. He was also, he had maintained that police position as well as a director's position. He was only being paid as a director, but he was still had a rank of captain. And he retired as a captain, which affected his pension situation. And we also had a lieutenant who had retired, Lieutenant Schuster, who was in the Detective Bureau of Major Crimes. And we had 2 sergeants who also retired. The 2 sergeants were in the patrol division, which poses, as we've been talking about, it poses a problem. You need to fill those patrol spots. So now, Caputo retires, but before he retired, the deputy director at the time was Mangarella, and he and Caputo got together that month once the decisions that they had to retire, and they had to move people around to try to perform those duties of the people that are going to retire. Obviously, it's a reasonable and expected function of these people to do. And then on March 1st, he's now the director. He's the boss. Caputo's gone. So he goes to see the mayor. And he's got to obviously introduce, and the mayor has appointed him as director, so they know each other, obviously. But the mayor and he have to have a discussion on the protocol of what he expects. You know, you got to call me on certain incidents, whatever it might be. All those incidentals involving the connection and the correspondence or the communication between that so important position of director of police and the mayor. And Mangarella will tell you, he says, I went in there just with blinders on. I'm not even thinking about finances. I know I just got 5 promotions I'd love to make. So he goes in, and when they get to that part of the conversation, he says, Mayor, I need to make 5 promotions. He said, it ain't happening. And he was sort of shocked. He got, as he talked about it, you know, I got hit with a reality hammer, or whatever way he wanted to explain it. The mayor then reviewed with him what's going on in the city in terms of money. All of the departments are frozen. They're not hiring. The only people being hired as police officers in New Brunswick for this 2-year period were off of a federal COPS grant. And what they tried to do with the federal COPS grant, which is federal money, it didn't involve the city's budget, is what they tried to do is they tried to hire cops that had been laid off in Newark and Carteret, Perth Amboy, or wherever. And with those monies, you try to fill it up. The police officer positions, not ranks. So he says, you're going to have to make do with what you got, just like I've been saying for in 2009. It's going on in 2010. And he said, find out what's going on with respect to these 2 sergeants in patrol, because that's the area that we've got concern with making sure it's filled. So Mangarella goes back, and he reanalyzes the situation, and he goes to the mayor, and he says, I need 2 sergeants. He said, there's no way of getting around it. He says, I'll give you 1. And in May of 2010, he got 1 sergeant, and what he had to do was take a sergeant off one of the other squads to put him in patrol, because you got to cover patrol. So he got 1 promotion at that time. That is the only promotion between January of 2009 and Steve Middleton being promoted in January of 2011. So now let's talk about what happens now. The mayor gets this advice, $2.5 million more is taken out of his budget. They got to deal with this situation. They also have to deal with all the terminal pay that had to be paid to these superior officers who had retired. It was a contractual obligation. Lachlan goes to work, and instead of paying them all in a year that they retire, which they're supposed to do, terminal pay is basically your accumulated sick time and any vacation time, or it might not be vacation time, but certainly accumulated sick time. And there's a formula that they're entitled to get paid for time that they didn't use. And it was hundreds of thousands of dollars. I think it was over $300,000 between all 5 guys. Lachlan did another tremendous job. Lachlan went to them and negotiated the payout of that over 5 years. It also helped the cops, because instead of getting a big number in the first year, they would spread it out over 4 or 5 years. And all of them agreed to do that. So now we have the situation where Mangarella knows that he's got to have the need to promote Steve Middleton. You have to have the money and the need. After this March meeting, in that March meeting, by the way, with Mangarella and the mayor, after he has the reality discussion that we talked about, he says, what about Steve Middleton? He's sitting number 1 on the list. The mayor says, I want to make Steve. But he says, we've got to have the money to do it. We don't have the money right now. But I want to make it before the list expires. Mangarella goes back and tells Steve that. He tells Steve, Steve acknowledges, Mangarella told me, he says, I want to promote you. I try to get you promoted right now. The mayor said, we don't have the money. And unless we get the need to do so, we can't promote you. What happens next? Now we've got the next lieutenant's list being called, because when Steve's list, in which he's sitting number 1 on, and by the way, that list had a whole bunch of guys on it. There was, he was, let me see, he was 7th. The sergeant's, the lieutenant's list had 19 took the test, 18 passed, 4 were appointed. He was the last one appointed because he was number 1 on the list. 4 guys were appointed. So you had 14 other guys who passed. They were never made off that list. You know why? Because there wasn't a need for a lieutenant. Just because you get put on a list doesn't guarantee you're going to have a promotion. And you'll hear people just say, when you get put on a list and you get promoted, thank God. Thank God I got the promotion. Thank God everything lined up and I was able to get promoted. So now, the next thing that happens is in June of 2010, the plaintiff's expert on liability, who has a real thing for the city of New Brunswick, he reports to the city that Tierney and another guy, Contreras, were they had 2 issues with respect to what was going on. One was that with respect to Tierney, his wife was still involved on his medical plan, and the other one was that he voted for the city election when he was no longer a resident of the city. The prosecutor's office, not the city of New Brunswick, investigated those charges. They investigated those charges over the summer. And on September 3rd, they told the city, there's no evidence against Contreras, we're not moving forward with any charge against them, but we want you to charge, or they did charge, Tierney with those 2 offenses, 2 fraud offenses. Keeping his wife on the payroll of the medical when he was no longer married to her, and this voter situation. September 3rd is the date that the prosecutor's office told the New Brunswick Police Department what happened. They charged him the same day. It was a Saturday. So as soon as the prosecutor's office said, our investigation is done, we're charging him, he was charged, and he was immediately removed from office at that time, and he had to be suspended with pay. That's also a contractual obligation of the law under the state. Unless he's a danger to himself or he gets indicted, you have to suspend him with pay. And now you wait, because he's still entitled to be innocent until proven guilty. We've got that premise throughout our system. So, but that happened. They removed him, and they suspended him, took him off the force. He wasn't on administrative duties or anything else. He was suspended with pay, which is what they've got to do. And then what happened, they had to fill that position of Tierney's position, who was a patrol lieutenant. And they had to fill that position with some overtime. So they were having sergeants and lieutenants filling that position. Steve Middleton was one of the guys, you heard this stuff, only white guys are getting the overtime and all that stuff. It's a lot of nonsense. They're not looking at anything about race with respect to that. They were filling their positions with people that were available. Steve Middleton made $3,000 overtime on this very detail. So Mangarella is watching this overtime. That's his job. He's running this department. He's got to verify what's going on in terms of costs. So Mangarella sees, we're bleeding overtime. I got sergeants and lieutenants working this position. He says, I'm going to the mayor. So he goes to see the mayor in November. He's got 2 months now of history of the overtime being paid with respect to Tierney's position. He says, we should make a lieutenant. He's number 1 on the list, so they didn't even have to talk about him. They know who it would be. We need to promote a lieutenant. The mayor says to him, he says, you gotta show me in dollars and cents that I'm gonna save money by promoting Steve or promoting a lieutenant instead of incurring this overtime. He then prepares a detailed memo that we're gonna show you with all the overtime expenses, and it did. It amounted to like $28,000. The mayor sees that now. He has a meeting with Mangarella in December, and he says, you've proven what we need to do. We're gonna promote him. Who? Steve Middleton's number 1 on the list. We're gonna promote him. But this is in December. He says, we don't have the money in 2010, but I can budget for his position and his promotion in 2011. They said, get a date, arrange a date between Steve and me, and we'll promote him. They arrange for the date of January 21. He gets promoted. He hasn't been skipped by anybody. He was not promoted in the timetable that Steve wanted to be promoted. Now let's talk about this captain's test, because his claim is that between March 1st of 2010 and August 31st, 2010, he wasn't promoted. And why is August 31st an important date? It was an important date because the captain's test was announced June 1st, 2011. Now think of this date. He's promoted January 21, 2011. Civil service doesn't even call for the test until 4 months after he's promoted. Do you think that the mayor, Mangarella, or any reasonable person is thinking about a sergeant who hasn't been promoted yet to lieutenant, or whether or not he's going to have enough time and grade to sit for a captain's test? He's not even a lieutenant. He hasn't even served as a lieutenant. To think that we were cognizant of the fact that we delayed his position for these 5 months in order to deny him a captain's position, first of all, he's got to take the test, and he's got to score better than all the other guys looking to take the test. It's so subjective and so unfair to think that Steve Middleton can claim to you that we denied him a position of being a captain. In fact, Mangarella, Caputo, and the mayor, once he became number 1, they recognize it's not uncommon. We know he's a black man, and we do have a dearth of minorities in the command positions. He was going to fill that void by promoting him to lieutenant. It worked in his favor. It didn't work against him. It wasn't the reason why he got promoted, but it was a great benefit that they had in mind to be able to show the citizens of the city who were claiming that we didn't have minorities in position, that we were going to be able to promote a minority when we had the opportunity to do so. You see, the problem is, they say we've never had a captain. You can't promote a black man, an Hispanic man, or a white man off of the list unless he's on the civil service test, and he comes out among the positions that makes him eligible to be promoted. So the fact that there was not a captain in there, it just didn't materialize. Civil service has no racial bias. They have no thinking about race, religion, creed, national origin, sexual preference. Those are all taboo. That's what civil service is all about. So there can't be any of that stuff. So we were very cognizant. Everybody loved Steve. Steve was a very good commander. You won't hear anybody come into this courtroom and say that he wasn't a good commander. He had the respect of the men as a sergeant. He had the respect of the men as a lieutenant. They wanted to promote Steve Middleton, and they did. You're going to hear the law in this case, which is the law against discrimination. There are 4 areas of a prima facie case. The first one is that he's got to be a suspect classification. He qualifies. He's a black man. The second criteria is that he was performing a protected activity. He was being a police officer, he took the test. And now he's number 1 on the test, so he covers that. Number 3, he was not promoted. He was promoted. So how do we get past that? And the next thing is, was he skipped by a non-minority? That didn't happen either. We promoted him when we could promote him, when we had the finances to do so. And frankly, they talk about it's unprecedented. I have never, in 40 years of doing this business, ever heard of a guy being promoted and then complaining about I wasn't promoted in time? In order to take a test that hadn't even been announced yet? I think it's an insult to your intelligence to follow that line of reasoning. If they wanted to discriminate against Steve, you know what they could have done? Because, by the way, that second test that we talked about, that was announced in May of 2010, that second lieutenant's test, he again spoke to Mangarella, who was the director. He says, should I take the test? He's now sitting number one, remember, on this whole test. That's going to expire that January. And the director gave him the right advice. He said, I can't tell you whether or not to take the test. All I can tell you is that the mayor's a man of his word and he wants to make you. But we need to have the money and the need to do so. So therefore, he couldn't say, don't take the test. Well, what happens? Steve takes the test and he comes out number 15 out of 15. ISIS, and I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, he probably didn't study too hard because he was going on the recommendation of the mayor and cognizant of the fact that the mayor wanted to make him. I think he basically was hoping that that's going to happen. Because you got to remember, everybody's pulling for him. But anyway, he's number 15. If they want to discriminate against him, you know what they would have done? They could have allowed the list to expire without making him. And then what would they have done? Hire off the next list. He's number 15 on the list. He had no chance of being promoted off that list. So if they had an intent to discriminate against Steve Middleton, that's what would have happened. They didn't do that. They promoted him. Now, what happens is Mangarella, 5 months after Steve gets promoted, he retires in June of 2011. And Caputo comes back on July 1st, 2011. The next claim, and by the way, when he then files a lawsuit, which was filed on February the 29th, 2012. This was 2 years after Mangarella became director. When he got that, when the city was filed with that lawsuit, first of all, you can imagine they were shocked that they were being sued by a guy that had been made on the promotion list because he wasn't made in time. And there was a discussion between Caputo and him. And the plaintiff came and he said, this has got nothing to do with you. He said, this is all about Pete, meaning Mangarella. And he admitted that he didn't have any intention of going after Caputo. So much for that promise, as you're going to hear. The next claim is the pursuit. This vehicle pursuit, the only time that a police officer has ever been disciplined with major discipline, they have never seen a pursuit like this. The difference here is you had, and with all the best intentions, you had a new sergeant, Sergeant Langan, and he had only been promoted a short period of time before. And they hear that there's a stolen vehicle in that's in North Brunswick. One of the New Brunswick detectives saw the vehicle after it was posted out that they had a stolen vehicle report. It comes back on the air, and the unmarked unit begins to follow the vehicle. They notify North Brunswick Police Department. North Brunswick Police Department begins the pursuit. This pursuit continues into New Brunswick. Based upon the area of North Brunswick it was, reasonable to assume they might go into New Brunswick. Steve, with all the best intentions in the world, says, let's go. He brings his sergeant out onto the road with him. He's sitting in the commander's seat. He's sitting in the passenger seat. This is the commanding, he's called the watch commander. He's in charge of this shift. All of the men on this shift, all the guys that are out there on this shift, he's in charge. He's got the sergeant sitting next to him. They proceed at excessive speeds up to a location on Jersey Avenue and Howe Avenue. And he wasn't charged for any of that stuff. You're going to see this tape. It goes on for 23 or 27 minutes, this chase. The multiple vehicles are now involved, and once the car comes into New Brunswick, they end up assuming the lead position. Again, I think, although you wouldn't normally see the commanders assume the primary position, first of all, there's rules with respect to the pursuit policy. There are AG guidelines, the Attorney General guidelines on pursuit. You got Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office guidelines that adopt these guidelines, and the departments, all police departments have to adopt them too. And New Brunswick adopted them, almost word for word. They have specific criteria that you must adhere to in pursuits. Why? You eight people know it as good as I do. You can't endanger the public based upon a pursuit. So they end up, because they thought that they were also the most experienced, and I give them that too. They were the most experienced, and probably Langan was the best driver. And he had every anticipation that they would probably be the best vehicle to be the lead pursuit vehicle. In any event, they assumed the lead position. You are not permitted to have vehicle contacts. We're not talking about contacts with the car being pursued trying to ram the police car. The police car cannot ram the other car. No vehicle contacts. You know how many vehicle contacts we had in this pursuit? 10. He was charged with 8 of them. Can't vehicle parallel. What that means is you can't pull alongside somebody. You're talking about going on roadways that have got two-way traffic. Wait till you see this tape, you're not going to believe it. Vehicles are pulling off the road, they're all kinds of stuff, excessive speeds. What is Steve Middleton doing during all this? He didn't report back to headquarters, which is his responsibility, what was actually going on. You'll see how calm he is, and that's one of his great traits, is he's calm under pressure. Well, he's so calm under pressure, he's notifying people that he's doing 40 miles an hour when he was doing 67. Doesn't report one of these vehicle contacts back to headquarters so that they could know what's going back at headquarters, because now Sabo hears, he's the captain, he hears that this pursuit is going on, he's listening to the radio transmissions. Steve has got the radio transmissions. He doesn't report one vehicle paralleling, he doesn't report any of these vehicle contacts, he's not talking about the excessive speeds, he's misrepresenting the speeds that are being attained during this pursuit. There were also unbelievable violations going through stop signs and red lights. You're supposed to slow down going through a red light. You're not going to control the actions of the maniac who caused all this stuff. So what happens is they ultimately, after they're trying to ram him, Sergeant Langan is in that car, and what Steve says to him is, you need to end this thing, because we can't go downtown. The captain has already advised, if this thing goes downtown into the city, it's got to be terminated. Steve says, we need to end this thing. Langan believes what he meant. I'm trying to impress my lieutenant. I'm trying to impress my boss. He says, I think what he's got to tell me is that I got to end this thing as soon as I can. So he then executes the last vehicle contact, 8 and 9, as referenced in the report. And the guy loses control and goes into the curb line. They then go ahead and they arrest the individual. And with respect to the arrest of the individual, you had Lemmerling, who was one of the detectives, takes him out of the car with Langan. They ordered him out of the car, he hesitated, so they pulled him out of the car, put him on the ground. And Lieutenant Middleton actually was involved in that extrication and the handcuffing. He actually handcuffed the guy on the ground. The commander, Captain Sabo, shows up on the scene, and he sees that, he hadn't heard that there was any excessive speeds. He thought it was a relatively benign pursuit, even though it extended so long. He sees Steve Middleton, and he says, geez, good job, you got the guy, and there's just minor damage to the police vehicle. He says, wait till you see the tape. Sabo said, really? So Sabo had to look at the tape anyway, because in every pursuit case, you've got to review the MVR tapes. Now what's important about this, you heard all that talk from Mr. Burke that there hadn't been any officer given major discipline for pursuits. There's a big reason for that, because before the MVR tapes in these vehicles, and they were put into cars over a period of time, they didn't have a manner in which to view actually what was going on to determine whether or not the officer was reporting correctly over the air. They never had a pursuit go this long, and they never had a pursuit that involved these kind of vehicle contacts. So this was unprecedented. And the thing that made it bad is that you had the guy who was supposed to know this stuff inside and out, Steve Middleton, sitting there allowing it to happen. He's the superior. So he got 8 days. That was a big break. They said that we're going to be talking about that? It was. If they had, if in this chase where you're seeing 80 miles an hour, 70 miles an hour, residential streets, run through red lights. You saw the one time one of the cars, and they weren't the only 2 disciplined. You had 2 other guys that were disciplined too. One guy was disciplined for cutting him off, and what caused, after Drury, who was a detective, cut him off, the plaintiff, the pursuit driver, went to the right through a parking lot and hit a parked car in the parking lot. The other guy was going the wrong side on a one-way street that he admitted to. I'm sorry, yeah, he was going down the wrong way on a divided highway. So he was disciplined. They were both given oral reprimands, both white guys. Langan was given 4 days. He was given 8 days. You know why? Because he's the boss. And you're going to hear everybody in this case that's got the authority, does IEAs, who is involved in discipline, including our expert, going to say, you're always going to hit the superior for more. He deserved to be hit for more. But I'll tell you what, if somebody was killed in this pursuit, they would have been indicted. He would have been terminated. That's how bad this pursuit was. They violated unbelievable amounts of guidelines. He got 23 charges. The driver got 20. He was hit to the charges with respect to the same charges that the driver got because he's sitting there allowing all this stuff to happen. Now, if the first thing that Langan did, if there was a first contact, and Steve was watching that, and he says, terminate this. And then he basically was going to bring up Langan on a charge that he was in violation of the AG guidelines because of that, there would have been nothing happening to him. But you had all of these violations occur in his presence, and he never did anything about stopping it. Thank God we didn't have somebody killed in this pursuit. And you're going to see the best evidence on that screen. You're going to hear some talk about mistakes made in this internal affairs investigation, and there were. This investigation, the file is that thick. You see it at the end of my thing? That's the internal affairs investigation. It doesn't include the tapes. There's about 15 tapes of taped witnesses, a tape of the MVR machine, tapes of the audio. This investigation went on for a long time, and everybody's being investigated. So one of the first things that they did, this is July 23rd. On August 7th, they went to interview Mr. Coleman. Mr. Coleman was the driver of the car. And they said, they're basically investigating the pursuit at this point. And Mr. Coleman tells them it's a taped interview on videotape. And Coleman says, I was so high on PCP, somebody gave me a bad reefer or whatever it was. He said, I was so drugged up. He said, I don't know nothing. I said, you know anything about the pursuit? Nothing. I don't remember anything. He said, what I do remember is being taken out of the car. And he says, and I got a scrape here on my shoulder. Once I came to, I got a scrape on my shoulder. He said he didn't allege that he was assaulted, didn't allege that there was excessive force or anything like that. Subsequently, about August 23rd, he writes a handwritten note from the jail. And he says, during the course of this incident, I was taken out of the car and subjected to excessive force. And I was assaulted. The police investigation had already been going on with respect to this whole pursuit, interviewing all the guys, all the reports. There's something that is called a use of force report. When an officer uses force, he has to file a use of force report in addition to the other reports, and that's pursuant to AG guidelines. There are no use of force reports filed because they don't have to do that when all you're doing is handcuffing somebody. In other words, they didn't have to deliver any blows. They didn't have to hit him with mace. They didn't have to use any compliance holds or anything like that. They basically took him out of the car and handcuffed him. You don't need to put a use of force report for every handcuffing incident. This was a routine handcuffing of this guy. All of the officers said the same thing. There were no injuries sustained to this guy, no apparent injuries. There was no resisting arrest. He wasn't charged with resisting arrest other than with respect to the pursuit situation. So that's what happened. Now, the mistake that was made is that Lemmerling was not the subject of the pursuit. Although he was involved in the pursuit, he was not one of the guys who were charged. Only 4 guys were charged. So because he wasn't the subject of the pursuit investigation, they should have pulled a number, and that means an IA number for Lemmerling. Dominguez, Sergeant Dominguez, who was the investigator, didn't do it. He made a mistake. And what happened is the other mistake he made is after the thing was investigated, and he concludes in his report that goes on for 25 pages, that they investigated the claim of excessive force from Mr. Coleman and determined that there was no excessive force, that there was no injuries, and whatever force was used in terms of taking him out of the car, was appropriate, and there was no, he didn't have any charges. So the mistake was that he didn't open up a file that basically would be a separate file with respect to that for Lemmerling, but it was covered, it was investigated. And you're going to hear this guy Rivera, this expert, basically talking about that being a problem. Well, we acknowledge that it was a problem. He should have opened up a file with respect to it, but that's a technical violation that they didn't have a separate number. But the case was investigated, contrary to what he says. It was investigated. And what they didn't do is they didn't send him a letter basically after he had written his report about I had excessive force. They didn't send him a letter saying the investigation is concluded and there was no force. So the officers have been exonerated, which is what they did. They want to do various things in this case to be able to show that there was a bad investigation, it was a shoddy investigation, and you shouldn't take any consideration of what's going on. They're trying to basically take your eye off the ball. You know why? Because the important thing is, what did Steve Middleton do wrong in this pursuit? And did they investigate this case because he filed a lawsuit against them? Do you really think that? They have an obligation to investigate every pursuit. That's all they did. And they investigated something that they had never seen before with the commander in the front seat. Never happened before. So, therefore, was there race in denying him, racial discrimination in denying him his promotion? I submit to you it's clearly not. You're going to hear the evidence. You've heard the evidence. The guy was promoted. This business about being promoted on his timetable, I'll tell you what, he didn't even know the timetable. Steve Middleton is sitting there, God, I just hope I get promoted, like everybody else would be. He got promoted when he was number 1 on the list, and all the guys behind him didn't get promoted. He was number 4. There was a bunch of guys that didn't get promoted. You don't see them file a lawsuit. He was promoted, and he filed suit. With respect to this, now as a result of him filing this lawsuit, we investigated him and gave him 8 days, 8 days, because of his outrageous actions in this case. When you'll hear Langan testify, Langan acknowledges what he did was wrong. He says, I got caught up in the moment. I'm trying to impress my superior. And as a result of being caught up in the moment, and I had got that, my boss sitting right there, he's not telling me to terminate the pursuit. And by the way, that's a word of art. Back at headquarters, if Sabo heard what was going on, if Starzinski heard what was going on, the true facts of what was going on, it was to terminate that pursuit. Because you know what they're doing is not only, as they continue to chase the guy's getting more and more outrageous. It's not worth it, it's a stolen car. They had video of the guy going in, the owner of the car going into a convenience store, whatever it was, and they see the guy getting in the car and stealing it. They're going to be able to find this guy. That's the whole point of the Attorney General guidelines. This is the city of New Brunswick, 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a summer day. Kids all over the place. I'm not saying that there were kids in here because fortunately no kid kicked the ball into the road and got hurt. Now let's talk about plaintiff's damages. Steve Middleton continued to do his job. He only got those 8 days. And he continued to do his job, and by the way, continued to do his job well. He made a mistake here. If he was anything like Langan, he would have accepted his punishment, recognized that he got the break of his life in only getting 8 days instead of being demoted or instead of being suspended for a longer period of time. So what happened is he's now involved in April 6, 2013 in a shooting. He did another good job. 4 different guys shot this guy on Sanford and Livingston Avenue. He's walking with a gun down the street. They're telling him, drop the gun, drop the gun. 4 different guys decide to shoot him at the same time because he had basically picked the gun up like he was going to shoot them. They're not really sure where he, which bullets hit him because they didn't do any ballistics to determine whose bullet actually struck him. And that really is not important because they all were using deadly force. They were permitted to do so. They were vindicated. There was no problem with respect to that. When you get discharged your weapon, you got another big investigation. Plaintiff never returned to work after April 6, 2013. He sought treatment with a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist. And he was, at that point, he was talking about not nightmares, depression, not being able to perform his job, thinking that, I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to return and do my job. It's post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of what happened. And you got to think when you're a cop, am I going to be able to do my duty and protect the citizens and the other guys out there when another situation like this comes up? So he continues to have all of this treatment. As a result of this, now let's move back because I'm going to get back to where this treatment continues. April 6, 2013. Now, after this pursuit on July 23, the first time that he goes to receive any treatment with respect to this emotional distress that he says he was having as a result of his treatment in the police department was on December the 5th, 2012. Okay? 5 months after the incident, 4.5 months after the incident, he goes and he seeks help with a Mrs. Stevenson, who was a psychotherapist. He was complaining to her of stress, trouble sleeping, anxiety, making critical decisions at work. He reported being praised at times, and other times he was questioned by his superiors. He feared being terminated because of the pursuit charges pending due to his appeal. He recognized that when he got this 8 days, by the way, Steve Middleton decided to use his rights, and he had every right. He objected to this discipline of 8 days. And what happened is that he had a hearing, he hired a lawyer, they were going for a hearing. But that hearing officer has the right to not accept to give less days, to determine he shouldn't get anything, or to give him more. So he obviously was under stress at that point about, well, by the way, the prosecutor's office has to look at these pursuits too. They had to make a determination that they weren't going to charge him in this case. Dodged another bullet. He also talked about his anxiety was worse in the last 3 to 4 months, which talks about from the pursuit to December 5th, 2012. He said, I'm having trouble at home in the last 3 to 4 months. He's got anxiety over the birth of a 3rd child and an unplanned pregnancy and resentment of the child. His relationship with the 2 mothers of his 3 children was complicated. These are his words. These are quotes right from his treatment. Now this is before the shooting. He continues to see Ms. Stevenson on April 12, 2013, so he doesn't see her again for about 5 months. Sees her April 18th and April 26th, Ms. Stevenson. On May 1st, 2013, he starts with a psychiatrist, Dr. Stefanelli, because now we're talking about, this is after the pursuit. So after the pursuit, he goes back to Stevenson. And he sees, the incident's April 6th, so he goes back April 12th, April 18th, April 26th. On May 1st, he starts seeing Dr. Stefanelli, who's a psychiatrist, and they file an application for accidental disability, which is a disability as a result of your job. It's with the state of New Jersey, and an officer who can't do his job anymore because of this trauma associated with the shooting and his inability to do his job. They file an application for disability. The application is actually filed, the forms were sent to the doctor. Application was actually filed on August 5th, 2013, when they actually applied for the pension. And Dr. Stefanelli's report states that he was under treatment and unable to do his job as a lieutenant, which is what you got to show. On September the 10th, 2013, he starts with a Dr. Gowda, who was referred to by Dr. Stevenson. He was a psychiatrist and a specialist who a lot of officers go to with respect to disability claims. On October 9, 2013, the plaintiff was discharged by Stevenson. Dr. Gowda then treats the plaintiff on September 10th to 13th, September 24th, October 1st, October 30th, November 26th, December 30th, January 29th, 2014, February 25th, 14, March 30th, 14. He then retires from the police department on April 1st, 2014. On April 15th, 2014, 2 weeks later, his application for disability pension is approved by the state of New Jersey. He's given 2/3 of his salary. Salary is $144,000 for the years that were involved in the calculation of this. Getting $96,000 a year tax-free, plus his medical for life as a result of this claim. On April 15th, he gets his pension. May 23rd, he's a no-show to Dr. Gowda. July 20th, 2014, Dr. Gowda trying to get a hold of him. He closes his file because the plaintiff failed to return any of his phone calls or set up any future appointments. Once he got this disability, that's it. No more treatment. Miraculous recovery. On October 24th, 14, this is now 6 months after he gets his pension, he goes to see Ms. Stevenson, and he said he's sorting out his identity as a retired police officer, and he wants her guidance. On November the 13th, 3 weeks later, Ms. Stevenson reports that he's seeking employment as a substitute teacher. On November 19th, 2014, 6 days later, he calls up and says, I'm done with treatment. I don't want any more treatment. Ms. Stevenson reports the plaintiff has a lack of commitment, and she noted that he has family stressors. He's now a teacher in Asbury Park. He first started as a security officer without a gun on September 8, 2015, making a $41,000 salary in addition to what he was making off this pension. And now, here we are. So you need to evaluate whether or not the damages are legitimate, but you're only going to get the damages if you determine that he was discriminated against. And I go back to the two claims. The first claim is, did we deny his promotion because of his race? When in fact the race was a big part of why they were happy to promote him? Did we investigate him for that pursuit based upon his race and or because he filed that lawsuit? I submit to you that the answers to those questions are a loud no to both questions. There's no discrimination in this case. So we're going to be able to hear the evidence in this case, and I'm going to ask for your attention at the conclusion of the case, and listen to the witnesses, listen to this testimony, and then we're going to be able to address you again at the conclusion of the case. Thank you for your interest and your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cannell. Ladies and gentlemen, why don't we give you a break? We'll let you stretch your legs. We'll let them use the jury room, John, and then if they want to take the walk down to the jury assembly room, we'll let you do that.
Okay.
And you've heard the first installment, you've heard the openings, you haven't heard any testimony at this point, so again, I would instruct you not to discuss the case among yourselves or with anyone else. Keep an open mind, don't form any opinions. We'll take about a 15-minute break, and then we'll have you back and start with some testimony. Okay?